The medal ceremony was scheduled for 0800 Christmas morning. 200 Marines stood in formation as Major General Whitmore prepared to pin the Navy Cross on Gunnery Sergeant Rosalind Achebe's chest. The medal was for the single most difficult sniper shot in Marine Corps history, a shot that saved 12 lives in conditions that should have made accuracy impossible. What nobody in that formation knew, what the official citation would never mention, was that 6 months ago the woman about to receive the nation's second highest combat decoration had been denied deployment because a colonel decided she was too heavy to serve. 6 months earlier, Camp Lejeune baked under a Carolina sun that turned the rifle range into a shimmering mirage of heat and dust. Gunnery Sergeant Achebe settled into her prone position, breathing slow and measured as she had 10,000 times before. The qualification course spread before her like a familiar conversation, targets waiting at distances that would challenge any marksman in the Corps. She felt the rifle become an extension of her body, the scope a second eye that saw what others could not. Before she began, she noticed a young lance corporal 3 lanes down, struggling with his breathing, his shots scattered across the target like desperate prayers. Achebe rose from her position and walked to him, her movement drawing curious glances from the other shooters. She knelt beside the young Marine and spoke quietly, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed out of place on the harsh range. "You're fighting the rifle," she told him. "It knows. You need to let it become part of you, not something you are wrestling into submission. Breathe with it. Let the shot surprise you." The lance corporal nodded, and on his next attempt his grouping tightened considerably. Achebe returned to her lane without another word, unaware that Colonel Desmond Price had been watching the entire exchange from the observation tower above. When her turn came, Achebe delivered what the range master would later call the most technically perfect qualification shoot he had witnessed in 23 years of service. Every shot found its mark with mechanical precision. At the extreme distances where most shooters prayed for acceptable groupings, her rounds punched through center mass as if the targets had personally offended her. The final score was not merely passing. It was record-setting. She collected her gear with the quiet efficiency that defined everything she did, allowing herself only a small moment of satisfaction. 14 years in the Corps had taught her that excellence was expected, not celebrated. What she did not expect was the runner who approached her before she reached the armory. "Colonel Price wants to see you in his office, Gunnery Sergeant." Immediately. Before we continue with what happened in that office, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you have witnessed someone being judged unfairly for how they look rather than what they can do. The walk to battalion headquarters felt longer than usual. Achebe had served under Price for 8 months and had learned to read the man's moods through the tone of his summons. An immediate meeting after a qualification shoot could mean commendation. It could also mean something else entirely. Colonel Price sat behind his desk with the practiced stillness of a man who believed his position granted him authority over truth itself. He did not invite her to sit. "Gunnery Sergeant Achebe," he began, his voice carrying the false warmth of a rejection letter. "I have been reviewing the deployment roster for the upcoming rotation to Afghanistan." Achebe felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had been told her name was on that roster. She had trained for 6 months specifically for this deployment. "Your qualification scores today were impressive," Price continued, as if reading from a script only he could see. "However, I have concerns about your overall physical readiness for the operational demands you would face." "Sir," Achebe replied, keeping her voice level despite the anger building behind her ribs, "I have exceeded every physical fitness requirement. My last PFT score was 297 out of 300. Price waved his hand as if swatting away an inconvenient fact. "The PFT measures metrics. Combat readiness requires a more holistic assessment. I have observed that your current physical condition may not be optimal for extended field operations in challenging terrain." The words hung in the air between them, and Achebe understood exactly what he was saying without saying it. She was too heavy, not by any official standard, not by any regulation he could cite, but by the standard that existed only in his eyes when he looked at her. "I am removing you from the deployment roster," Price concluded. For your own safety and the safety of the Marines who would depend on you. Achebe stood at attention, her face betraying nothing, while something inside her cracked along fault lines she had spent years trying to seal. She requested permission to be dismissed, received it, and walked out of that office with her spine straight and her eyes forward. She did not see Staff Sergeant Cody Brennan waiting in the hallway, but she heard his voice clearly as she passed. "Told you she would not make the cut," he announced to the two Marines beside him, his voice pitched to carry. Too much dead weight, slowing her down. Achebe kept walking. Her hand tightened on her rifle case until her knuckles ached, but she kept walking. She had 14 years of practice at keeping walking. What she did not know yet was that her absence from that deployment roster would set in motion a chain of events that would end with her making the most impossible shot any Marine had ever attempted. On Christmas Eve, in a sandstorm, with 12 lives hanging on her ability to prove every doubter catastrophically wrong. The base gymnasium at 0400 was supposed to be empty. Achebe had counted on that emptiness the way a wounded animal counts on the darkness of its den. She stood before the mirror in the locker room, stripped down to her PT gear, and forced herself to look at what Colonel Price had seen. The reflection showed a woman built like her father, broad shoulders, and powerful legs designed for lifting heavy things and putting them down again. Her father had carried that body to Olympic bronze in weightlifting before carrying it to America in search of something better for his children. She had inherited his frame and his stubborn refusal to be what others expected. But standing there in the harsh fluorescent light, she could only see what Price had seen, what Brennan saw every time he looked at her, what the Corps had been whispering about for 14 years, even as she outshot and outperformed every critic who questioned whether she belonged. The sound of the gym door opening pulled her back into herself. She dressed quickly and stepped out to find Master Sergeant Jerome O'Yelleran loading plates onto a barbell with the practiced ease of a man who had been doing it for decades. "Figure I would find you here," he said without looking up. "Word travels fast on a base this size. Faster when it concerns something people have been waiting to gossip about." Achebe said nothing. O'Yelleran had been her instructor at Scout Sniper School, had written the recommendation that earned her the 0317 designation, had watched her break records that men twice her size could not touch. If anyone had earned the right to speak to her in this moment, it was him. He finished loading the bar and finally turned to face her. His skin was darker than hers, his accent carrying traces of Lagos that matched her own family's cadence. He had walked the path she was walking 20 years before her, and the weight of that shared journey hung between them. "Price pulled the same thing on me in '94, O'Yelleran said. Different words, same meaning. Told me my leadership style was not compatible with the unit's needs. What he meant was my face was not compatible with his comfort." "What did you do?" Achebe asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "I kept shooting. I kept being undeniable. And eventually I outlasted him." O'Yelleran sat down on the bench and looked at her with eyes that had seen every form of injustice the military could produce. "You are the best shooter I have ever trained, Rose. Not the best female shooter. The best shooter. I have your records memorized because I use them to torture every new class of sniper candidates. What Price sees when he looks at you has nothing to do with what you are." The words should have helped. They did help, somewhere beneath the layers of anger and shame that had wrapped around her chest since leaving that office. But they could not undo what had been done. Later that morning, Achebe forced herself to go to the base gym during normal hours. She refused to hide. She refused to let Price or Brennan or anyone else believe they had broken something in her. The weight room was crowded with Marines pursuing fitness with the desperate energy of people whose careers depended on physical performance. She had just begun her warm-up sets when Brennan appeared beside her, his entourage of admirers trailing behind him like pilot fish following a shark. He made a show of examining the weights she had selected. "You know, Achebe," he announced loudly enough for half the gym to hear, "I have been thinking about your situation. Maybe I could help you out. I used to compete in bodybuilding, so I know a thing or two about cutting weight. First thing you need to do is stop eating whatever it is that got you looking like that." Laughter rippled through his followers. A few other Marines looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. Achebe continued her set as if Brennan had not spoken, her form perfect, her breathing controlled. Brennan leaned closer. Silent treatment, huh? That is fine. Just trying to help a fellow Marine reach her potential. Though I guess some of us have more potential to reach than others. He walked away to a chorus of snickers, leaving Achebe alone with the iron and her rage. She finished her workout without acknowledging that anything had happened, but that night in her quarters she sat on the edge of a rack and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she was carrying. Not the physical weight that Price and Brennan obsessed over, but the weight of being constantly measured against a standard that had nothing to do with her abilities. 3 buildings away, Captain Yuki Tanaka was working late in the company office, reviewing deployment rosters for the upcoming rotation. Tanaka had earned her commission through OCS after 6 years enlisted, and she had developed an instinct for spotting irregularities that her peers often missed. Tonight, that instinct was screaming. She pulled up Achebe's service record and spent an hour reading through qualifications, commendations, and performance reviews that painted a picture of a Marine who should have been on every deployment roster the battalion produced. Then she cross-referenced the current roster and found Achebe's name conspicuously absent. Tanaka made a note to ask questions in the morning. She had learned long ago that the Marines who got overlooked were often the ones the Corps needed most, and something about this particular oversight felt deliberate in a way that made her uncomfortable. The next afternoon, Tanaka found Achebe at the range, putting rounds downrange with the methodical precision of someone working through complicated emotions one trigger, pull at a time. "Gunnery Sergeant," Tanaka said, waiting for Achebe to clear her weapon before continuing. "I have been looking at the deployment roster. I noticed you are not on it." Achebe's expression revealed nothing. "Colonel Price felt my physical readiness was not adequate for the operational demands." Tanaka studied her for a long moment. "Your last PFT was 297. You hold 3 battalion marksmanship records. What physical readiness concerns could possibly apply?" "You would have to ask the colonel," Achebe replied, and something in her voice told Tanaka everything she needed to know about what had really happened in that office. Tanaka nodded slowly. "I intend to. And Gunnery Sergeant, I'm going to fix this. But you need to be ready because when I do, you'll have to prove every doubter wrong in a combat zone. Can you do that?" Achebe met her eyes with a steadiness that had been forged over 14 years of proving herself to people who had already decided she could not. "Yes, ma'am. I can do that." What neither of them knew was that proving herself would require a shot that no one in the history of the Marine Corps had ever made on a night when 12 lives would depend on her ability to do the impossible. Captain Tanaka filed her formal challenge to Achebe's removal through proper channels on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, the entire battalion knew that someone was questioning Colonel Price's judgment, and by Wednesday morning, Achebe found herself summoned to headquarters for what Price called a supplementary fitness evaluation. The evaluation was not standard. It was not in any regulation Achebe had ever read. It consisted of a 12-mile forced march with full combat load, followed immediately by an obstacle course, followed by a timed shooting qualification, followed by a physical fitness test that would have exhausted a fresh Marine who had not just completed 3 hours of grueling exertion. Price observed the entire process from a shaded position near the finish line, his face unreadable as Achebe pushed through each successive challenge. Other Marines stopped their own training to watch, some with curiosity and others with the uncomfortable awareness that they were witnessing something that felt more like punishment than evaluation. Brennan was among the observers, and he made sure his voice carried whenever Achebe was within earshot. "She is slowing down. Look at her breathing. No way she makes the time hack on this one." But Achebe did make the time hack. She made every time hack. She completed the forced march 7 minutes under the cutoff, navigated the obstacle course with the efficiency that drew reluctant nods from the instructors, shot a qualification score only 2 points below her record-setting performance, and finished the PFT with numbers that would have been impressive for someone who had not just spent half a day being tested to destruction. When she crossed the final finish line, she did not collapse. She did not bend over gasping for air. She stood at attention and reported her completion to the evaluating officer while sweat poured down her face and every muscle in her body screamed for rest. Colonel Price reviewed the results for a long moment before speaking. "These numbers are acceptable," he said, as if she had barely scraped by rather than demolished standards that most Marines would struggle to meet fresh. "I will take them under advisement." Achebe requested permission to be dismissed and walked away without looking back. She made it to the tree behind the barracks before her legs gave out, and she sat against an oak tree for 20 minutes waiting for her body to stop shaking. The rumors started that same evening. Brennan had been busy. By the time Achebe returned to the barracks, half the battalion had heard that she had failed her deployment fitness standards and was being considered for administrative separation. The lies spread faster than truth ever could, and Achebe found herself fielding sideways glances and whispered conversations that stopped whenever she entered a room. 3 days later, she found Brennan holding court in the common area, entertaining a group of junior Marines with an animated retelling of her supposed failure. "Heard she could not even finish the obstacle course," he was saying when Achebe walked in. "Had to be helped off the wall by 2 instructors. Probably would have had a heart attack if they had not stopped the evaluation early." The junior Marines saw Achebe first. Their faces shifted from amusement to discomfort as Brennan continued his story, oblivious to her presence. Kinda sad, really. 14 years in, and she still does not understand that some people just are not built for this work. There is no shame in admitting you are not cut out for combat operations. The shame is pretending you are something you are not. Achebe walked past the group without stopping, without acknowledging that she had heard anything. But Corporal Diana Vasquez, one of the junior Marines in Brennan's audience, watched her go with something that looked like recognition in her eyes. Later that night, Vasquez would look up Achebe's actual qualification scores and fitness records in the battalion database. What she found would change how she looked at both Achebe and Brennan from that moment forward. The following week, Captain Tanaka presented her documentation to the battalion executive officer. She had compiled every fitness report, every qualification score, every commendation in Achebe's 14-year career. She had also documented the supplementary evaluation that Price had ordered, noting that no other Marine in the deployment roster had been required to complete anything similar. The XO reviewed the materials and made a phone call to Colonel Price. The conversation was brief and apparently uncomfortable, because within an hour Price himself appeared in Tanaka's office. "Captain," he said with the controlled anger of a man unaccustomed to being questioned, "you seem to have concerns about my personnel decisions." "I have concerns about inconsistent application of deployment standards," Tanaka replied evenly. "Gunnery Sergeant Achebe has exceeded every documented requirement for this rotation. If there are additional requirements I am not aware of, I would appreciate clarification so I can ensure all personnel are evaluated equally." Price's jaw tightened. "Achebe's deployment status is not your concern, Captain. With respect, sir, the readiness of my company is absolutely my concern. And if our best sniper is being excluded for reasons that are not documented in any regulation I can find, I need to understand why, so I can plan accordingly." The standoff lasted only a few seconds, but in those seconds Tanaka saw something shift in Price's calculation. He was politically ambitious, and she had just made it clear that a paper trail now existed. "Fine," he said finally. "Achebe deploys with the rotation. But understand this, Captain. If she fails in theater, if her physical condition compromises any operation, it will be on your record as well as hers." After Price left, Tanaka sat alone in her office for a long time. She had won this battle, but she understood the cost. She had made an enemy of a colonel, and she had put her own career on the line for a Marine she barely knew. She hoped Achebe was worth it. That evening, Tanaka found Achebe at the armory, cleaning her rifle with the meditative focus of someone who found peace in precision. "You deploy in 6 weeks," Tanaka told her. "Price approved your inclusion in the rotation." Achebe looked up, and for just a moment her careful mask slipped to reveal the relief underneath. "Thank you, Captain. Do not thank me yet." Tanaka's voice carried a weight that made Achebe's gratitude fade. Price is expecting you to fail. He is counting on it. And there's something else you should know. Staff Sergeant Brennan has been assigned to the same unit. He specifically requested the transfer after he heard you were deploying. Achebe absorbed this information with a slow nod. Of course he did. Whatever happens over there, Tanaka continued, you need to be undeniable. Not good. Not excellent. Undeniable. Because there are people who want to see you fail, and they will use anything less than perfection as proof that they were right about you all along. Achebe stood and met Tanaka's eyes with the steady resolve of a woman who had spent her entire career being undeniable. I understand, Captain. I will not let you down. As she walked back to her quarters, she did not notice Brennan watching from the shadows near the motor pool. His expression carried something darker than mockery now, something that looked almost like hatred. He had 6 weeks to prepare, and he intended to use every one of them to ensure that Rosalind Achebe's deployment would be remembered as the failure everyone expected. The 6 weeks before deployment passed in a blur of final preparations and careful avoidance. Achebe trained with an intensity that bordered on obsession, spending every available hour at the range, or in the gym, or studying terrain maps of Helmand Province until the valleys and ridgelines appeared in her dreams. She knew what was waiting for her in Afghanistan, and she knew what was waiting for her among her own unit. She intended to be ready for both. Master Sergeant O'Yelleran found her at the sniper range on her final evening at Camp Lejeune. The sun was setting behind the tree line, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that seemed inappropriate for a place dedicated to the art of precise violence. Achebe was running calculations for wind drift at extreme distances, her notebook filled with numbers that would have looked like gibberish to anyone who had not spent years learning to read the invisible language of ballistics. O'Yelleran watched her work for several minutes before speaking. I taught you everything I know about making long shots, he said finally. But there is one technique I have never shared with anyone. I was saving it for someone who might actually need it. Achebe looked up from her calculations. O'Yelleran had never mentioned holding anything back in all the years she had trained under him. He sat down beside her and pulled out his own notebook, its pages worn soft from decades of use. Most snipers calculate for wind at the firing position and at the target, he explained. Maybe they account for crosswinds at the midpoint. But at extreme ranges beyond 2,000 meters, the wind does something most shooters never learn to read. It braids. He showed her a diagram that looked like nothing she had seen in any official training manual. The wind at distance does not flow in straight lines, he continued. It wraps around terrain features, creates pockets of calm and turbulence that shift by the second. Most shooters at that range are guessing. But if you learn to read the braid, if you can see the pattern in how dust moves and grass bends at multiple points along the bullet's path, you can make shots that everyone else thinks are impossible. For the next 3 hours, O'Yelleran taught her everything he had spent 30 years learning about reading wind at distances that most snipers would never attempt. By the time full darkness had fallen, Achebe's mind was racing with possibilities she had never considered. Why did you wait until now to teach me this? She asked as they packed up their gear. O'Yelleran was quiet for a moment. Because I needed to know you would face a situation where you might need it. After what Price put you through, after everything Brennan has done, I know you're going to end up in a position where impossible is the only option left. When that moment comes, I want you to have every tool I can give you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small brass coin, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. This was my father's, he said. He carried it through the Biafran War. Gave it to me when I enlisted. It is supposed to bring clarity in moments when everything else is chaos. I want you to have it. Achebe tried to refuse, but O'Yelleran pressed it into her palm. Bring it back to me when you return, he said. That way I know you will come back. The transport to Afghanistan left before dawn the next morning. Achebe sat in the crowded belly of the aircraft, surrounded by Marines she had trained with for months, some of whom refused to meet her eyes. Brennan had positioned himself directly across from her, and he spent the first hour of the flight making quiet comments to the Marines beside him, comments pitched just loud enough for Achebe to hear without being loud enough to constitute official harassment. Corporal Diana Vasquez sat 3 seats down, and Achebe noticed that the younger Marine kept glancing in her direction with an expression that suggested internal conflict. Vasquez had been part of Brennan's audience during his rumor-spreading campaign, but something had changed in how she looked at both of them. Achebe filed the observation away and focused on the mission briefing materials in her lap. The flight to Afghanistan took 18 hours with 2 refueling stops. By the time they touched down at Bagram and transferred to the helicopter that would carry them to FOB Sentinel, Achebe had memorized every detail of their operating environment. Helmand Province was Taliban country, a landscape of valleys and mountains that had been swallowing invaders for centuries. The briefing materials mentioned an elevated threat level from enemy sniper activity, with 3 Marine sniper teams having been neutralized in the past 4 months. FOB Sentinel was smaller than Achebe had expected, a collection of reinforced structures and defensive positions carved into a hillside overlooking a valley that stretched toward Pakistan. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Marcus Delacroix, met them at the landing zone with the nervous energy of a young officer on his first deployment. "Welcome to Sentinel," he announced over the fading roar of the helicopter. "I hope you all slept on the flight, because we do not get much rest here. Enemy contact is a daily occurrence. We have lost good Marines to a sniper we have not been able to locate. They call him a ghost." Achebe felt the familiar calm settle over her that always came when she entered an operational environment. The politics of Camp Lejeune, the harassment from Brennan, the doubt from Price, all of it faded into background noise. Here there was only the mission and the skills she had spent 14 years perfecting. The briefing that night painted a grim picture. The Ghost had killed 7 Marines in the past 3 months, always from extreme range, always disappearing before counter-sniper teams could respond. Intelligence believed he was a foreign fighter with professional training, possibly former military from a nation with a sophisticated sniper program. As Achebe studied the map of previous engagements, she felt something nagging at the edge of her perception. The attack locations did not make sense for a single shooter. The angles were wrong, the timing too precise. She made a note to study the pattern more closely when she had access to the full intelligence reports. That night she lay on her rack listening to the distant sound of gunfire echoing across the valley. Somewhere out there, an enemy was waiting. And somewhere in this very FOB, another enemy was waiting too. She touched the brass coin O'Yelleran had given her and let its worn surface remind her why she was here. The first shots came just before midnight. The radio crackled with reports of enemy contact at observation post Echo, 2 kilometers east of the main FOB. Achebe grabbed her rifle and headed for the door, only to find Brennan blocking her path with a smile that carried no warmth. "Let the real snipers handle this," he said. "Would not want you slowing us down out there." Achebe met his eyes with 14 years of patience and rage compressed into a single look. Then she stepped around him and walked into the darkness toward the sound of the guns. The darkness outside FOB Sentinel swallowed light like a living thing. Achebe moved through it with the practiced silence of a hunter, her rifle an extension of her body as she navigated the rocky terrain toward observation post Echo. Behind her she could hear other Marines mobilizing, but she had already put 50 meters between herself and the FOB before anyone else cleared the wire. The gunfire ahead was sporadic now, the sharp crack of American weapons answered by the deeper bark of enemy rifles. Achebe found a position on a ridge overlooking the observation post and settled into her scope. The night vision revealed a scene of controlled chaos below. 4 Marines were pinned behind a rock formation, while muzzle flashes winked from 3 positions on the opposite hillside. She read the wind by watching the dust kicked up by bullet impacts, calculated the distance at 640 meters, and placed her crosshairs on the nearest muzzle flash. The shot surprised her in the way O'Yelleran had taught, her body executing the mechanics while her mind remained calm and detached. The muzzle flash disappeared. She shifted to the second position and fired again. Another flash extinguished. The third shooter realized what was happening and attempted to relocate, but Achebe tracked his movement through the scope and sent a round into the darkness, where she calculated he would emerge. The screaming that followed confirmed her calculation was correct. The Marines below seized the opportunity and pushed forward to secure the area. By the time Achebe descended from her ridge, the engagement was over. A young corporal was being treated for a gunshot wound to the shoulder, but he would survive. The 3 enemy fighters would not. Staff Sergeant Brennan arrived with the main response force 10 minutes later. He surveyed the scene with barely concealed irritation, his eyes finding Achebe standing quietly near the wounded Marine. "Who made those shots?" he demanded. The corporal being treated looked up from his bandages. "She did," he said, nodding toward Achebe. "Came out of nowhere. Dropped all 3 of them before we even knew she was there." Brennan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He turned and walked away to coordinate the cleanup, leaving Achebe alone with the knowledge that she had just proven herself in combat and that it would change nothing in how he saw her. The following days established a rhythm of patrols and overwatch rotations. Achebe performed her duties with quiet excellence, but the other snipers in the unit maintained their distance. Brennan had spent months poisoning their perception of her, and one successful engagement was not enough to overcome the narrative he had constructed. Lieutenant Delacroix noticed. He had reviewed the after-action report from Echo and had begun paying closer attention to the gunnery sergeant, who seemed to exist on the margins of her own unit. What he saw impressed him in ways that made Brennan's whispered warnings seem increasingly hollow. The intelligence briefing on their 5th day at Sentinel focused entirely on the Ghost. 7 confirmed kills over 3 months, all from estimated ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. The enemy sniper had become a psychological weapon as much as a physical one, and Command wanted him eliminated. Achebe requested access to the complete intelligence file and spent an entire night studying the data. Attack locations, times, angles of fire, weather conditions during each engagement. She mapped everything on the terrain chart that hung in the operations center, and slowly a pattern emerged that made her blood run cold. The shots were impossible for a single shooter, not because of the difficulty, but because of the geometry. 2 of the attacks had occurred within 4 minutes of each other at locations that would have required the shooter to cover 3 kilometers of rough terrain between shots. Either the Ghost could teleport, or the intelligence analyst had missed something fundamental about what they were facing. She brought her concerns to Delacroix the next morning. "Sir, I do not think we are hunting one sniper. I think there are multiple shooters operating in coordination. The Ghost is not a person. It is a team." Delacroix studied her map with growing unease. "If you are right, that changes everything about how we approach this." Before they could discuss further, the operations center erupted with radio traffic. An IED had struck a patrol vehicle 3 kilometers south of the FOB. Multiple casualties. Achebe's spotter, Corporal Reginald Okonkwo, was among the wounded. She reached the medical station as they were loading Okonkwo onto a medevac helicopter. His left leg was shattered below the knee, and blood soaked through the bandages wrapped around his torso. But his eyes found hers through the chaos, and he grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. "Do not let them send you home," he said, his voice ragged with pain. "You're the only one who can stop the Ghost. Promise me." Achebe gripped his hand. "I promise." The helicopter lifted off in a storm of dust and noise, carrying away the partner she had trained with for 2 years. She stood watching until it disappeared over the mountains, then walked back to the operations center to find Brennan waiting with a tablet in his hand. "Just got word from Camp Lejeune," he announced loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Colonel Price is requesting a status update on your performance. Apparently, he has concerns about whether you're meeting operational expectations." Achebe felt the familiar weight of injustice settle onto her shoulders. Even here, even 7,000 miles from Camp Lejeune, Price was still trying to end her career. "Also," Brennan continued with obvious satisfaction, "I have submitted a formal request to have you removed from sniper operations. Without a spotter, you're a liability. Command will make the final call, but I have recommended you be reassigned to base security until the rotation ends. The Marines around them shifted uncomfortably. Some of them had seen Achebe's performance at Echo. Some of them were beginning to question the stories Brennan had told. That night, Achebe knelt beside her rack and prayed for the first time since arriving in country. She prayed for Okonkwo's recovery. She prayed for wisdom to navigate the enemies surrounding her. And she prayed for the strength to keep her promise, even as the forces aligned against her grew stronger with each passing day. When she opened her eyes, she found the brass coin O'Yelleran had given her and pressed it between her palms. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the wire, the ghost was waiting. Somewhere in this very FOB, Brennan was working to destroy her. And somewhere across the ocean, Price was pulling strings to ensure she never got the chance to prove him wrong. She had faced impossible odds before. She would face them again. The only question was whether she would face them alone. Lieutenant Delacroix denied Brennan's request the following morning. The decision came after a long night of reviewing performance reports and after-action summaries that painted a very different picture than the one Brennan had been selling for months. Achebe had saved 4 Marines at observation post-Echo. Her shooting was documented as exceptional by multiple witnesses. Removing her from sniper operations based on the loss of a spotter would be operationally foolish. Brennan took the news with a tight smile that promised future complications. He cornered Achebe outside the mess hall that afternoon, positioning himself close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. Delacroix might think you belong here, he said quietly, but we both know the truth. You got lucky at Echo. One good engagement does not make you a real sniper. When the pressure comes, when it really matters, you're going to choke. And I'm going to be there to watch it happen. Achebe met his eyes without flinching. Why do you hate me so much, Brennan? What did I ever do to you? Something flickered across his face, a crack in the armor of contempt he wore so comfortably. He stepped back without answering and walked away, leaving the question hanging in the dusty air between them. That evening, Corporal Vasquez found Achebe cleaning her rifle in the armory. The younger Marine hesitated at the doorway for a long moment before entering, her posture carrying the awkwardness of someone about to confess something uncomfortable. "Gunnery Sergeant," she said, "I need to tell you something about Staff Sergeant Brennan." Achebe continued her work, but nodded for Vasquez to continue. "Before you arrived at Lejeune, I looked up to him. He was everything I thought a sniper should be. Strong, confident, skilled. He took me under his wing during training, and I believed everything he said about the other Marines, including what he said about you." Vasquez paused, gathering courage for what came next. "After he started spreading those rumors about you failing the fitness evaluation, something did not sit right. So I looked up your actual records. Your qualification scores, your PFT results, your service history. I found everything he said was a lie." This was not news to Achebe, but she appreciated the confirmation. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I found something else." Vasquez's voice dropped lower. Brennan failed sniper qualification twice before he finally passed. His scores were barely adequate. You passed on your first attempt with numbers that broke battalion records. He has been trying to destroy your reputation because you are everything he wishes he could be. The revelation settled into place like the final piece of a puzzle Achebe had been assembling for months. Brennan's hatred was not about her weight or her gender or any of the excuses he had wrapped around his cruelty. It was about inadequacy. It was about a man who had scraped by watching someone effortlessly exceed him and being unable to accept what that meant about himself. "Thank you for telling me," Achebe said. "It does not change what I have to do here, but it helps to understand." Vasquez nodded and turned to leave, then stopped at the door. "For what it is worth, Gunnery Sergeant, I think you are the best shooter in this unit, and I do not think I am the only one starting to see it." The intelligence briefing the next morning brought news that pushed all personal conflicts into the background. A major operation was being planned for Christmas Eve, a convoy through the valley where the Ghost had claimed most of his victims. Command believed the enemy sniper would not be able to resist such a target-rich environment, and they wanted to use the convoy as bait to draw him into the open. Achebe listened to the plan with growing dread. She had shared her theory about multiple shooters with Delacroix, but it had not filtered up to the officers planning this operation. They were preparing to send Marines into what could be a coordinated ambush, thinking they faced a single enemy. She requested a private meeting with Delacroix after the briefing. "Sir, I need you to look at something." She spread her annotated map across his desk, the one covered in lines and angles and calculations that had kept her awake for nights. The ghost attacks form a pattern that is only possible with multiple coordinated shooters, she explained. At least 5, probably more, positioned at elevated points throughout the valley. If we send a convoy through there expecting one sniper, we're going to lose people. Delacroix studied the map with the expression of a man watching certainties crumble. "You are suggesting we modify the entire operational approach based on your analysis." "I'm suggesting we do not send Marines into a kill zone blind." Achebe met his eyes. "Give me overwatch on this operation. Let me get into position early and confirm what we are facing before the convoy enters the valley. If I am wrong, we proceed as planned. If I am right, we save lives." The lieutenant was quiet for a long moment. "What you're asking would put you alone in hostile territory for hours before the operation begins. If the enemy spots you, there is no extraction available." "I understand the risk." Delacroix nodded slowly. "I will make it happen. But Achebe, if you're right about this, you need to understand what it means. You will be the only sniper with a clear angle on multiple elevated positions. Everyone in that convoy will be depending on you to neutralize threats they cannot see." Achebe thought of Okonkwo's words before the medevac. She thought of O'Yellerin's lessons about reading the wind at impossible distances. She thought of 14 years of being told she did not belong. And she thought of the Marines who would die if she let doubt win. "I will not let them down," she said. That night, she checked her equipment 3 times and slept with O'Yellerin's coin pressed against her chest. Christmas Eve was 2 days away. Somewhere in the valley, the enemy was preparing their ambush, and Rosalind Achebe was preparing to prove that the woman they had dismissed as too heavy to serve was about to become the only thing standing between her fellow Marines and death. The day before Christmas Eve passed in a haze of final preparations and quiet farewells. Achebe spent the morning zeroing her rifle for the extreme distances she might face, making micro-adjustments that would be invisible to anyone who had not spent years learning to read the subtle language of precision shooting. Every click of the scope was a conversation with physics, a negotiation between human intention and the immutable laws that govern bullet flight. Vasquez found her at the range during a break in the afternoon. The younger Marine carried 2 cups of coffee and offered one without asking if Achebe wanted it. "I heard about your Overwatch assignment," Vasquez said. "Alone in the valley for 6 hours before the convoy moves. That is a long time to be without support." Achebe accepted the coffee and allowed herself a small sip before responding. "It is what needs to happen. If there are multiple shooters out there, someone has to identify their positions before our people drive into the kill zone." Vasquez was quiet for a moment, watching Achebe work. "Can I ask you something personal, Gunnery Sergeant?" Achebe nodded without looking up from her scope. "Why do you stay? After everything Price did to you, everything Brennan has put you through, you could have taken a desk assignment years ago. You could have let them push you out. Why do you keep fighting to be somewhere that so many people have made clear they do not want you?" The question hung in the air between them, and Achebe found herself thinking about her father, about a man who had carried 200 kilograms on his shoulders at the Olympics and then carried his entire family across an ocean to a country that did not always welcome them. "My father came to America with nothing," she said finally. "No money, no connections, no guarantee that anything would work out. He used to tell me that the only weight that matters is what you carry for others." His strength was never about winning medals. It was about what he could do for the people who depended on him. She turned to face Vasquez directly. "I stay because there are Marines who need someone watching over them from a distance they cannot see. I stay because the day I let people like Price and Brennan decide what I am worth is the day I stop being worthy of the uniform I wear." And I stay because my father did not carry us all this way for me to quit when the weight gets heavy. Vasquez blinked rapidly and looked away, but not before Achebe saw the moisture gathering in her eyes. The younger Marine cleared her throat and reached into her pocket. "I want you to have this," she said, pressing a small object into Achebe's palm. It was a brass button, old and worn, with an eagle emblem barely visible on its surface. "It belonged to my grandfather. He was a Marine in Korea. Carried it through Chosin Reservoir. My grandmother gave it to me when I enlisted and told me to give it to someone who reminded me of him." Achebe looked at the button, then at Vasquez. "I cannot accept this. It is your family history. My grandfather was 5'4" and weighed 130 pounds, Vasquez replied. Everyone told him he was too small to be a Marine. He proved them wrong at the coldest battle in Corps history. Something tells me you are about to do the same thing." That evening, the FOB held an impromptu Christmas Eve vigil. Someone had found a small artificial tree and decorated it with whatever could be scrounged from care packages and personal belongings. Marines gathered in the common area, some singing carols off-key, and others simply sitting in quiet reflection. The war felt far away for a few precious hours. Achebe stood at the edge of the gathering, watching her fellow Marines find moments of peace in a place designed for violence. Delacroix approached her with 2 cups of something warm that smelled vaguely of cinnamon. "Last chance to back out," he said, offering her one of the cups. "No one would think less of you if you decided this mission was too risky." Achebe shook her head. "Those are my people out there tomorrow, Lieutenant. Whether they know it or not, whether they want me or not. I did not come 7,000 miles to watch them die, because I was afraid." Delacroix nodded slowly. "For what it is worth, Gunnery Sergeant, I am glad you're on our side. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that I see what you are. Not what Brennan says you are. Not what Price decided you were. What you actually are. And what is that, sir?" Delacroix smiled. "The best sniper I have ever served with. And probably the bravest Marine I have ever met." He walked away before she could respond, leaving her alone with the weight of his words and the weight of what tomorrow would bring. She touched the 2 pieces of brass in her pocket, O'Yellerin's coin and Vasquez's button, and let them remind her of everyone who had carried impossible weight before her. At 2,200 hours, she gathered her gear and reported to the departure point. The helicopter that would insert her into Overwatch position was warming up on the pad, its rotors cutting through the cold night air. Vasquez was there to see her off, along with several other Marines who had quietly begun to recognize what Brennan had tried to hide from them. Brennan himself stood apart from the group, watching with an expression Achebe could not read. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and something passed between them that might have been understanding or might have been a final declaration of war. Achebe climbed into the helicopter without looking back. The door closed behind her, and she felt the aircraft lift into the darkness. Below, FOB Sentinel shrank to a cluster of lights, and then disappeared entirely behind the mountains. She was alone now, alone with her rifle and her training and the promise she had made to a wounded Marine on a medevac stretcher. In 6 hours, the convoy would enter the valley. In 6 hours, she would find out if her theory was right, and if she had what it took to save the people who had spent months doubting whether she belonged among them. The helicopter banked toward her insertion point, and Gunnery Sergeant Rosalind Achebe began to pray. The helicopter touched down in a narrow ravine 2 kilometers from her designated Overwatch position. Achebe was out the door before the skids fully settled, her boots hitting frozen ground as the aircraft lifted away and disappeared into the night. Within seconds, she was alone in enemy territory with nothing but her rifle, her training, and the darkness pressing in from every direction. She moved through the terrain with the patience of a predator who understood that speed was the enemy of stealth. Every step was calculated, every shadow evaluated for threat before she committed her weight to the next patch of ground. The mountains of Helmand Province had been swallowing soldiers for centuries, and she had no intention of becoming another ghost in their collection. The temperature dropped steadily as she climbed toward her Overwatch position. By 100 hours her breath was forming clouds that she had to control carefully to avoid giving away her location. The cold seeped through her gear and into her bones, but she had trained in worse conditions, and her body knew how to function when comfort was no longer an option. She reached her position at 0230, a rocky outcropping that provided clear sight lines into the valley below, while offering enough concealment to hide her silhouette from enemy observation. The convoy route stretched beneath her like a pale ribbon in the moonlight, winding through terrain that offered a dozen perfect ambush points. Achebe settled into her hide and began the slow work of scanning the surrounding ridgelines. Her scope moved methodically across each potential sniper position, searching for the telltale signs of human presence that most observers would miss. A rock that seemed slightly out of place, a shadow that did not match the angle of the moonlight, the faint heat signature of a body pressed against cold stone. For 2 hours, she found nothing. The valley remained silent, except for the whisper of wind through the rocks and the occasional distant cry of an animal she could not identify. Doubt began to creep in at the edges of her concentration. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe the ghost was a single shooter after all, and she had convinced Delacroix to modify an entire operation based on a theory built from wishful thinking. Then, at 0447, she saw the first one. A flicker of movement on a ridgeline 1,800 meters to her east, so brief that anyone not specifically looking for it would have dismissed it as imagination. But Achebe had spent 14 years training her eyes to catch exactly that kind of mistake, and she knew immediately that she was looking at a human being trying very hard not to be seen. She marked the position and continued scanning. Over the next hour, she found 6 more. 7 shooters total, positioned in a crescent formation that would create overlapping fields of fire across the convoy route. Her theory had been conservative. This was not just an ambush. It was an execution. She keyed her radio and spoke in a whisper that barely carried past her own lips. Sentinel Actual, this is Overwatch. Confirm 7 enemy snipers in elevated positions along convoy route. Request immediate halt to convoy departure. The response came back scratchy with distance, but clear enough. Overwatch, Sentinel Actual. Convoy departed on schedule at 0430. They are 40 minutes from the valley entrance. Achebe felt her stomach drop. The convoy was already moving. 40 minutes from driving into a kill zone where 7 professional shooters were waiting to tear them apart. Understood, Sentinel Actual. Requesting permission to engage. The pause that followed lasted only seconds, but felt like hours. Then Delacroix's voice came through the static. Overwatch, you are clear to engage. You're the only asset with eyes on the threat. Whatever you can do, do it now. Achebe began her calculations with a calm that surprised even herself. 7 targets spread across nearly 3 kilometers of terrain. The convoy would be in the kill zone for approximately 12 minutes. That gave her less than 2 minutes per target, assuming she could acquire and engage each one without being spotted and without missing. It was impossible. Every principle of sniper doctrine said that a single shooter could not neutralize 7 dispersed targets before they scattered or returned fire. The distances were too great, the variables too numerous, the margin for error non-existent. She thought of her father lifting impossible weight. She thought of O'Yellerin teaching her to read the wind when everyone else was just guessing. She thought of Vasquez's grandfather surviving temperatures that should have killed him. She thought of every person who had ever told her she could not do something, and every time she had proven them wrong. Then she stopped thinking and started shooting. The first target was the closest, 1,400 meters to her southeast. She placed the crosshairs on center mass, felt the wind pushing from her left at approximately 8 kilometers per hour, adjusted 2 clicks right and 1 click up, and squeezed the trigger with the gentle pressure of a lover's touch. The rifle kicked against her shoulder. 1.2 seconds later, the enemy sniper slumped forward over his weapon and did not move again. Achebe was already shifting to her second target before the sound of her shot finished echoing across the valley. The element of surprise was gone now. The remaining 6 shooters would be scrambling to identify her position, adjusting their plans, preparing to hunt the hunter. She found the second target attempting to relocate and sent a round through his chest at 1,600 meters. The third was smarter, staying motionless in his hide, but his scope caught the moonlight for just a fraction of a second, and that was enough. Achebe punched a hole through him at 1,750 meters. 3 down, 4 remaining, and somewhere in the distance, the rumble of convoy engines was growing louder. The fourth shooter made his move, sprinting between rock formations in a desperate attempt to reach better cover. Achebe tracked him through her scope, calculated his speed and trajectory, and placed a round exactly where he would be in 1.4 seconds. He dropped mid-stride and tumbled down the hillside like a broken puppet. 4 down. The convoy was entering the valley. She could see the headlights now, a line of targets that would be visible to the remaining 3 enemy snipers within minutes. She found the 5th shooter and fired. The round struck stone inches from his head, sending fragments into his face. He screamed and clutched his eyes, and Achebe's second shot silenced him permanently. Then something punched through the rocks beside her head, showering her with stone chips that sliced across her left arm. One of the remaining shooters had found her position. Achebe rolled to her secondary firing point as another round cracked through the space she had just occupied. Blood was running down her arm now, soaking into her sleeve, but she ignored it and brought her rifle back up. The shooter who had spotted her was good, but he had made the mistake of firing twice from the same position. She put a round through his throat at 1,900 meters. 6 down, 1 remaining, and he was the one she had been dreading most. The final shooter was positioned at extreme range, barely visible even through her scope. Her rangefinder put him at just over 3,000 meters, beyond the effective range of her rifle, beyond any shot she had ever attempted in training or combat, beyond anything that should be possible. But he had a clear angle on the convoy, and in approximately 90 seconds, Lieutenant Delacroix and a dozen other Marines would drive directly into his crosshairs. Achebe pressed O'Yellerin's coin against her chest, felt Vasquez's button dig into her thigh, and began calculating the most important shot of her life. 3,010 meters. The number burned in Achebe's mind as she stared through her scope at the distant figure who held 12 lives in his hands. At that range, her bullet would travel for nearly 4 seconds before reaching its target. For seconds during which wind, gravity, air density, temperature, and 100 other variables would conspire to push the round off course. For seconds during which the enemy sniper could shift position by inches and transform a killing shot into a harmless miss. The convoy headlights were brighter now, the lead vehicle perhaps 60 seconds from entering the kill zone. Through her scope, she could see the final shooter settling into his position, adjusting his own rifle, preparing to do what he had been trained to do. He was good. She could tell by the economy of his movements, the professional patience with which he waited for his targets to deliver themselves. Achebe's wounded arm throbbed with each heartbeat, blood still seeping through the makeshift bandage she had wrapped around it between shots. The pain was distant, irrelevant, something happening to a body she was no longer fully inhabiting. All that mattered now was the calculation. She remembered O'Yellerin's lesson about the wind braiding at extreme distances. She watched the dust devils forming and dissolving in the valley below, tracking how they moved across the terrain between her position and the target. The wind was not constant. It shifted and swirled, creating pockets of turbulence that would push her bullet in different directions at different points along its flight path. Most snipers would have declared the shot impossible and called for the convoy to halt. But halting the convoy would leave 12 Marines stranded in a valley with an enemy sniper who could reposition and engage at will. There was no good option. There was only the shot. She began her calculations. Distance 3,010 meters. Elevation differential approximately 200 meters downhill. Temperature hovering just below freezing. Humidity negligible. Wind from the southwest at the firing position approximately 12 kilometers per hour. Wind at the target position appeared lighter, perhaps 6 kilometers per hour. Wind at the midpoint was the mystery, the variable that would determine whether her bullet found flesh or stone. Achebe watched a bird riding the thermals halfway between her position and the target. It dipped and rose in patterns that revealed the invisible currents pushing through the valley. She traced its flight with her eyes, reading the air the way O'Yelleran had taught her, seeing the braid taking shape in her mind. The convoy was 40 seconds out. The enemy sniper was adjusting his scope, making final preparations. Through her own scope, Achebe could see his finger moving toward the trigger guard. She made her adjustments. 14 clicks of elevation to account for the extreme drop. 7 clicks of windage for the conditions at her position. And then the impossible part, the adjustment for wind. She could not measure at distances she could not see. She added 2 more clicks right, trusting the pattern she had read in the dust, and the bird, and the way the grass bent on the far ridge line. 30 seconds. The lead vehicle was almost in the kill zone. Achebe exhaled slowly, letting her body settle into the stillness that preceded every shot. Her heartbeat slowed. Her wounded arm stopped existing. The world contracted to the circle of her scope, and the tiny figure 3 kilometers away. The enemy sniper's rifle moved, tracking the approaching convoy. In seconds, he would have a clear shot at the lead vehicle, at Lieutenant Delacroix, at Marines who had no idea death was watching them from above. 20 seconds. Achebe's finger found the trigger. She did not squeeze. Not yet. She was waiting for something, a moment of alignment between all the variables she had calculated and all the instincts she had developed over 14 years of sending bullets across distances most people could not comprehend. 15 seconds. The bird she had been watching dipped suddenly, caught in a downdraft that pushed it toward the valley floor. In that moment, Achebe understood the wind pattern at the midpoint, understood how her bullet would ride the same current before climbing back toward its target. 10 seconds. She adjusted 1 final click to the left, compensating for the downdraft she now knew was waiting at the halfway mark. 5 seconds. The enemy sniper's finger curled around his trigger. Achebe fired. The recoil pushed against her shoulder as the bullet began its 4-second journey across 3,000 meters of mountain air. She did not blink. She did not breathe. She watched through her scope as the tiny figure in the distance prepared to take a shot. 1 second. 2 seconds. The enemy sniper began to squeeze his trigger. 3 seconds. Achebe saw dust kick up near his position as crosswinds buffeted the terrain around him. For seconds, the enemy sniper's head snapped back. His rifle discharged harmlessly into the sky as his body crumpled sideways and tumbled from his perch. He rolled twice before coming to rest against a boulder, motionless, finished. Achebe allowed herself 1 breath. Then she keyed her radio. Sentinel Actual, this is Overwatch. All 7 targets neutralized. Convoy route is clear. I say again, convoy route is clear. The response came back with an edge of disbelief that even radio static could not hide. Overwatch, confirm 7 enemy Kia from your position. Confirmed, Sentinel Actual. 7 enemy Kia. A different voice came through the radio, one she recognized as Brennan's. He sounded shaken in a way she had never heard from him before. That last shot was over 3,000 meters. That is not possible. Achebe looked down at the convoy passing safely through the valley below, at the Marines who would live to see Christmas morning because she had done what everyone said could not be done. Apparently it is, she replied. She leaned back against the cold stone of her position and let the exhaustion finally wash over her. Blood was pooling in her sleeve. Her muscles were screaming from hours of tension. The adrenaline that had carried her through 7 engagements was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that made even breathing feel like effort. But somewhere in the valley below, 12 Marines were alive. And somewhere in the distance, Christmas morning was beginning to paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. Gunnery Sergeant Rosalind Achebe closed her eyes and allowed herself to smile. The extraction helicopter found her 2 hours after sunrise on Christmas morning. Achebe had not moved from her position, partly because protocol required her to maintain overwatch until the convoy completed its mission, and partly because she was not entirely certain her legs would support her if she tried to stand. The blood loss from her arm wound had left her lightheaded, and the cold had seeped so deeply into her body that her fingers had stopped responding to commands sometime around dawn. The medic who reached her first took one look at the blood-soaked sleeve and the pallor of her skin and immediately called for a stretcher. Achebe refused it. She walked to the helicopter under her own power, her rifle slung across her back, her spine straight despite the trembling in her legs. She had not let them see her weak at Camp Lejeune. She would not let them see her weak now. The flight back to FOB Sentinel took 15 minutes. By the time the helicopter touched down, word of what had happened in the valley had spread through the entire base. Marines lined a landing zone, not because anyone had ordered them to, but because they needed to see for themselves the woman who had done the impossible. Achebe stepped off the helicopter into a wall of silence. Dozens of faces stared at her, some she recognized and some she did not, all of them wearing expressions that ranged from disbelief to something that looked almost like reverence. She had expected skepticism. She had expected demands for proof. She had not expected this. Lieutenant Delacroix pushed through the crowd, his arm in a sling from a minor injury sustained when his vehicle hit rough terrain during the convoy. He stopped in front of her and for a moment seemed unable to find words. 3,010 meters, he finally said. We had the trajectory analyzed before you landed. 3,010 meters in variable wind conditions with a wounded arm. The analysts are saying it might be the longest confirmed kill shot in Marine Corps history. Achebe did not know how to respond to that. She had not been thinking about records when she pulled the trigger. She had been thinking about 12 Marines driving into a kill zone. How many did we lose? She asked. Delacroix's face broke into something between a smile and a look of wonder. None. We did not lose anyone. Because of you. The words hit her harder than any bullet could have. She felt her composure crack, felt the emotions she had been suppressing for hours begin to push against the walls she had built around them. She blinked rapidly and looked away, not trusting herself to speak. A commotion near the edge of the crowd drew her attention. Marines were parting to let someone through, and when Achebe saw who it was, she felt something shift in her chest. Brennan walked toward her with the uncertain gait of a man approaching something he did not understand. His face was pale, his usual arrogance stripped away to reveal something raw and uncomfortable underneath. He stopped 3 feet from her and stood there for a long moment, his mouth working silently. I was in the third vehicle, he said finally. When you called in that the route was clear, I thought you were lying. I thought there was no way one person could have neutralized 7 snipers from a single position. I spent the entire convoy run waiting to die. He paused, swallowing hard. I watched the recovery teams collect the bodies. I saw where they fell. I saw the angles, the distances. I saw what you did. Achebe waited. She had imagined this moment many times over the months of harassment and doubt. But now that it was here, she found she did not feel the satisfaction she had expected. She just felt tired. I was wrong about you, Brennan continued. His voice cracked on the words. I was wrong about everything. I spent years telling myself that you did not belong here because admitting you were better than me meant admitting things about myself I did not want to face. I told myself your records were flukes. I told myself your qualifications were handed to you. I told myself anything that let me keep believing I was something I am not. He looked at the ground, unable to meet her eyes. You saved my life today. You saved all our lives. And you did it after I spent months trying to destroy your career because I was jealous of a woman who had the courage to be excellent in a world that punishes her for it. The crowd had gone completely silent. Marines who had heard Brennan's rumors, who had laughed at his jokes, who had looked at Achebe with doubt because of his poison, now watched him dismantle his own lies in front of everyone. I am requesting a transfer when we get back to Lejeune, Brennan said. You deserve to serve in a unit where nobody questions whether you belong. And I need to figure out how to be the kind of Marine who builds people up instead of tearing them down. He straightened and met her eyes for the first time. I am sorry, Gunnery Sergeant, for everything. Achebe studied him for a long moment. She thought about all the pain he had caused her, all the doubt he had planted, all the nights she had questioned her own worth because of his cruelty. She thought about how easy it would be to reject his apology, to let him carry the weight of his failures without relief. But she also thought about her father and about the weight we carry for others. "I accept your apology," she said simply. Brennan nodded once, sharply, and stepped back. The crowd began to disperse, but the whispers that followed were different now. They were not whispers of doubt. They were whispers of awe. The medics finally convinced Achebe to let them treat her arm. As they cleaned and bandaged the wound, Delacroix appeared with a satellite phone. "Someone wants to talk to you," he said. Achebe took the phone and heard a familiar voice on the other end. "I just received word about what happened in that valley." It was Master Sergeant O'Yelleran, his voice thick with emotion. "They're saying you made a shot that nobody thought was possible. They're saying you saved an entire convoy single-handed. They're saying you might have just become the most decorated female sniper in Marine Corps history." "I just did what you taught me," Achebe replied. "No," O'Yelleran said firmly. "I taught you the technique. The courage, the resolve, the refusal to quit when everything was against you. That was all you. That was always you." Achebe felt the tears finally escape, rolling down her cheeks as Christmas morning light streamed through the medical tent. "I still have your coin," she said. "I promised I would bring it back." "You keep it," O'Yelleran replied. "Something tells me its work is not finished yet." Through the tent flap, Achebe could see Marines beginning to gather for an impromptu Christmas celebration. Someone had found a radio, and holiday music was drifting across the FOB. In a few hours, she would learn that Colonel Price had been informed of her actions, and that an investigation into his conduct was being opened. In a few days, she would learn that she was being recommended for the Navy Cross. But in that moment, all she knew was that 12 Marines were alive because she had refused to accept the limits others had placed on her. And that was the only Christmas gift she had ever needed. The official after-action report took 3 days to compile. Intelligence officers flew in from Bagram to interview Achebe, to examine her firing position, to verify the distances and angles that had seemed impossible until the evidence made them undeniable. They recovered the bodies of all 7 enemy snipers and confirmed that each had been killed by a single round from Achebe's rifle. The ballistics matched. The timeline matched. The impossible had become documented fact. The identity of the final target, the one she had eliminated at 3,010 meters, sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. His name was Viktor Fedorov, a former Spetsnaz marksman who had defected to serve as a mercenary trainer for insurgent forces. He had been on watch lists for years, credited with killing coalition soldiers across 3 different countries. The ghost had not been a ghost at all. He had been one of the most dangerous snipers in the world, and Achebe had killed him with a shot that defied everything the tactical manuals said was achievable. Delacroix recovered fully from his minor injuries and made it his personal mission to ensure that Achebe's actions received proper recognition. He wrote a detailed recommendation for the Navy Cross that ran to 12 pages and included statements from every Marine who had witnessed her performance or benefited from it. The recommendation was endorsed at every level of the chain of command and forwarded to Washington with unusual speed. Captain Tanaka called from Camp Lejeune with news that spread through the FOB within hours of its arrival. Colonel Price was under investigation. Multiple service members had come forward with accounts of discriminatory treatment after learning what had happened to Achebe. Women and minorities who had served under Price's command over the years had finally found the courage to speak about the barriers he had placed in their paths, the opportunities he had denied them, the careers he had damaged through selective application of standards that existed nowhere in regulation. Achebe took the news with mixed feelings. She had never wanted revenge against Price. She had only wanted the chance to serve alongside her fellow Marines without having to prove her worth twice as hard as everyone else. But if his removal meant that future Marines would not face what she had faced, then perhaps some good would come from the pain he had caused. Vasquez found her on Christmas evening sitting on a supply crate behind the motor pool, watching the sun set over the mountains. The younger Marine carried 2 cups of hot chocolate that someone had included in a care package, and she handed one to Achebe without asking. "The whole base is talking about you," Vasquez said. "I heard 2 privates arguing about whether your shot was the longest in Marine Corps history or just in the top 3. They could not agree on the exact record." "It does not matter," Achebe replied. "Records are just numbers. What matters is that everyone came home." Vasquez nodded slowly. "Can I ask you something, Gunnery Sergeant?" "You can ask. When you were up there in that position, alone, with 7 enemy snipers between you and the convoy, were you scared?" Achebe considered the question carefully. She thought about the hours of cold darkness, the moment she confirmed her theory about multiple shooters, the impossible calculation for the final shot. "I was terrified," she admitted. "Every shot I took, I was afraid it would be the one that missed. Every second I waited, I was afraid I had calculated wrong." Fear never goes away. You just learn to work through it instead of letting it work through you. Vasquez was quiet for a moment. "I want to be a sniper," she said finally. "A real one, not just someone who qualified and moved on. I want to learn to do what you do." Achebe looked at her, seeing something of herself in the younger woman's determination. "It is not an easy path. You will face people who tell you that you do not belong. You will have to prove yourself over and over again to people who have already decided you cannot succeed." "I know," Vasquez replied, "but I watch you prove them all wrong. If you can do it, maybe I can too." Achebe reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass button Vasquez had given her before the mission. She pressed it back into the younger Marine's palm. "Your grandfather carried this through Chosen. I carried it through the valley. Now you carry it through whatever comes next. And when you find someone who reminds you of him, you pass it on." Vasquez clutched the button with tears forming in her eyes. "Thank you, Gunnery Sergeant, for everything." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of debriefings and preparations for redeployment. The rotation was ending, and Marines of FOB Sentinel were going home. Achebe spent her remaining days training her replacement, a young sergeant who listened to her instruction with the focus of someone who understood he was learning from a legend. Brennan kept his word and submitted his transfer request. He departed on an early transport without ceremony, offering Achebe only a nod of acknowledgement as he boarded the aircraft. She returned the nod and watched him disappear into the sky. Whatever he had been to her before, whatever damage he had caused, that chapter was closed now. What he chose to become next was his own burden to carry. The day before her own departure, Achebe received word that her Navy Cross recommendation had been approved at the highest levels. The ceremony would take place at Camp Lejeune on Christmas morning, exactly 1 year after the shot that had changed everything. Her family had been notified and was making arrangements to attend. That night, she stood alone on the perimeter of FOB Sentinel, looking out at the valley where she had done the impossible. The mountains were silent now, the ghosts of the enemy snipers buried along with their ambitions. Somewhere down there, in the rocks and dust, was the place where Viktor Fedorov had fallen. Somewhere down, there was the proof that limits only exist until someone refuses to accept them. She touched O'Yellerin's coin in her pocket and allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like to stand before her father in full dress uniform, a Navy Cross on her chest, while he watched his daughter receive honors that most Marines would never dream of achieving. Tomorrow, she would begin the journey home. Tomorrow, she would start becoming whoever she was meant to be on the other side of this experience. But tonight, she simply stood in the darkness and let the weight of everything she had accomplished settle into her bones. She had carried impossible weight, and she had not broken. The flight home took 36 hours with connections through Bagram, Ramstein, and finally the east coast of the United States. Achebe slept through most of it, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion it had been holding at bay since Christmas Eve in the valley. When she stepped off the transport at Camp Lejeune, the Carolina air felt different than it had when she left. Or maybe she was the one who had changed. The first thing she noticed was that Colonel Price's office was dark. His nameplate had been removed from the door, and the window that had once displayed his collection of military awards was bare. She learned later that he had been relieved of command 2 weeks earlier, pending the outcome of an investigation that had expanded to include his entire career. 17 service members had filed formal complaints. The man who had decided she was too heavy to serve would never command Marines again. Master Sergeant O'Yelleran was waiting for her at the barracks. He looked older than she remembered, the year having carved new lines into his face. But his eyes carried the same warmth that had guided her through the darkest moments of her training. "Welcome home," he said simply. She reached into her pocket and pulled out his coin, the brass worn even smoother now from the countless times she had pressed it against her palm in the mountains of Afghanistan. "I promised I would bring it back." O'Yelleran took the coin and held it for a moment, then pressed it back into her hand. "I told you to keep it, and I meant it, but I have something else for you now." He reached into his own pocket and withdrew a medal, its ribbon faded with age, its surface carrying the patina of decades. Achebe recognized it immediately. It was a bronze star, the same one she had seen hanging in his office for years. "This was mine," he said, "for my first deployment, when I was young and stupid and thought I had something to prove. I kept it all these years as a reminder of who I used to be. But you have become something I never managed to achieve. You have become undeniable. And I want you to have this as a reminder that you always were." Achebe tried to refuse, but O'Yelleran closed her fingers around the medal with the gentle firmness of a father teaching a child to hold something precious. "Pass it on someday," he said. "When you find someone who needs to know that impossible is just a word people use when they are afraid to try." The week before Christmas passed in a blur of preparations and reunions. Achebe's family arrived 3 days before the ceremony, her parents and 2 younger siblings crowding into a hotel room near the base. Her father, Emmanuel Achebe, moved more slowly than she remembered, his Olympic athlete's body finally showing the weight of 73 years. But when he saw her in uniform for the first time since her deployment, he stood straighter than he had in years. "You carry yourself differently," he observed in the Yoruba-accented English of her childhood, "like someone who knows what she is capable of." "I learned it from you," she replied. He shook his head. "No, you learned it from yourself. I only showed you it was possible." Christmas morning dawned clear and cold over Camp Lejeune. 200 Marines assembled in formation on the parade ground, their breath forming clouds in the winter air. Achebe stood at attention in her dress blues, the uniform pressed to perfection, every medal and ribbon aligned with geometric precision. Major General Whitmore approached with the Navy Cross displayed in a presentation case. The citation was read aloud, each word carrying across the silent parade ground. 3,010 meters. 7 enemy combatants eliminated. 12 Marine lives saved. The longest confirmed sniper kill in Marine Corps history. When the general pinned the medal to her chest, Achebe felt its weight settle against her heart. It was lighter than she expected, lighter than the weight she had carried for 14 years, while people like Price and Brennan tried to convince her she did not belong. Lighter than the weight of doubt and discrimination and the endless need to prove herself twice as hard as everyone else. The formation was dismissed, and the crowd that had gathered to watch began to disperse. Achebe found herself surrounded by Marines who wanted to shake her hand, to thank her, to tell her that her story had changed how they saw their own limitations. She accepted their words with grace, but her eyes kept searching the crowd for the faces that mattered most. She found her father standing apart from the others, watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. She walked to him, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Emmanuel Achebe did something he had not done since she was a child. He wrapped his arms around her and held her close, his body trembling with emotions he had spent a lifetime learning to suppress. "You carry the weight," he whispered in Yoruba, then repeated it in English. "All of it. Everything they put on you. Everything they said you could not do. You carried it all, and you did not break." Achebe felt the tears finally come, rolling down her cheeks and soaking into her father's shoulder. She had spent 14 years trying to make him proud. She had spent 14 years trying to prove that his sacrifice in bringing their family to America had been worth it. And now, standing in his arms on Christmas morning with a Navy Cross on her chest, She finally understood that he had been proud of her all along. Captain Tanaka found her after the crowd had thinned. The woman who had risked her own career to fight for Achebe's deployment stood at attention and rendered a crisp salute. "Congratulations, Gunnery Sergeant. You earned this." Achebe returned the salute. "I could not have done it without you, Captain. You gave me the chance when no one else would." Tanaka smiled. "I gave you the chance. You did the rest." That evening, Achebe sat with her family in the hotel room, sharing a Christmas dinner that her mother had insisted on preparing despite the inadequate kitchen facilities. Her siblings peppered her with questions about Afghanistan, about the shot, about what it felt like to be famous. She answered as best she could, but the truth was that she did not feel famous. She just felt like a Marine who had done her job. Later, after everyone else had gone to sleep, she stepped outside and stood alone in the parking lot, looking up at the stars. She thought about Vasquez, who was spending Christmas with her own family while dreaming of becoming a sniper. She thought about O'Yelleran, who had given her tools no one else possessed. She thought about Delacroix, who had trusted her when trust was the hardest thing to give. She thought about all the Marines she had served with, the ones who had doubted her, and the ones who had believed. And she thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, standing in Colonel Price's office while he told her she was too heavy to serve. She touched the Navy Cross through her jacket and felt the brass of O'Yelleran's coin in her pocket. The weight she carried now was different. It was not the weight of doubt or discrimination or the endless need to prove herself. It was the weight of everything she had accomplished, everyone she had saved, everything she had become. It was the weight of a legacy she would spend the rest of her life building. If this story moved you, share your thoughts about what resonated most with you, or tell us about someone you know who proved doubters wrong through their actions rather than their words.